Chapter 1 Yona Yonasail. Could sadness be a thing, an object that one could carry? Could loneliness and loss be substantial, if not of substance, then of ether, like a figure of smoke over a fire, impossible to grasp, but lingering like the smell of musk in a robe? Yona had tried to rid herself of all the things that still carried the scent of her husband. It had taken determined effort to sweep away his ghost from her life. Her daughter had been easier to put out of mind since the infant had passed so shortly after birth. The girl had not been in this world long enough to make a mark, just to be named. Then she was gone. It was the ghost of her daughter's future that Yona had fled from, leaving the estate where she had carried the child for 9 months, putting behind her the grass courtyards where she had pictured her daughter learning to walk. By leaving, she had also banished all those memories of her husband as well. So she shouldn't have felt the loss for either now, as she sat in the carriage that had come to a halt, the rain drumming on its roof. She tried to warm her chilled hands over the coals in her ember box, but they had grown so faint they threw off no heat. The wrought iron grill over them was cold to the touch. Yona felt the sadness weighing on her like a wet robe, but she couldn't shrug its black-gray heaviness any more readily than she could banish the cold from the cab of the carriage. Where had that sadness, that loneliness stowed away? She hardly had any possessions left where it could lurk anyway. She had given away or burned her husband's belongings. Her own clothes that she had worn around him, she gave to the servants she had left behind. She would buy new clothes in the city. Surely she would need them, or she might be marked as a hayhead from the countryside. That would not be fitting for a newly appointed member of the King's Council of Elders. She had already impressed the soldiers who came to accompany her on her journey when she met them at the door of her manor with nothing but a sword, a saddle, and a single drawstring bag. They had expected more baggage from a lady. They didn't know river towners. They didn't know Yona Yonasail. Was it in the trunk with her saddle, this loneliness she still felt? Or the drawstring bag with her remaining garments? Did it slither into the scabbard of her sword? If so, could it be cut to ribbons with the repeated sheathing of her blade? Perhaps she could move ahead faster than her loneliness could keep up. She shut the grate over the embers, drew up her hood, and stepped out of the carriage. The air had turned to water, the road to a river blooming with muddy flowers where the raindrops dimpled its surface. Yona and her city soldiers were not lost. They were not stopped in some nameless bend in the road or on a featureless stretch of country lane. They were in a village, the main avenue by the look of the timber houses, but it might have been a ghost town for all the life the place showed. Doors were closed, shutters pulled in, and not a single sign of light peeked through a curtain or under the gap in a door. She would expect an empty street on such a night, but such weather called for lanterns to burn bright, fires to be stoked, and the interiors of homes to glow with the light of comfort and welcome. Not the emptiness, not this darkness, like a village emptied by plague. Then she caught sight of the branch hanging above the door of the nearest house. She had to step closer, avoiding a puddle as she did so. One of the soldiers noticed her moving away from the shelter of the carriage and called out to her, "Lady Yonasail!" But she ignored him. If the branch was what she suspected, they had more complicated matters to worry about than the weather. She stepped under the eaves of the house and shielded her eyes from the dripping water to peer at the branch. Blue-black bark, the underside whiskey-colored where it peeled back from the stem. To confirm her suspicions, in the cluster of heart-shaped leaves she could see a bunch of purple berries. Elderberries. It was not difficult now to make out the branches tacked on the lintels of all the doors along the avenue. Of course the town seemed empty, she thought. The people were in mourning and hiding, for a spirit child had died and it was being buried that very night. But how to explain this to soldiers of the city who mocked country superstition and at worst were obligated to suppress it with all the force of the king and council's laws? A council she now served upon. She sighed. This was the first of what she knew would be many compromises and contradictions before her, and she had yet to even reach the city walls. The soldier who had called to her before, his rank a captain, was moving to her side. He had removed his cloak and stretched it out over her head to catch the dripping from the eaves. Closer now, she noted his features. His receding hairline and scarred lip bespoke experience. But with such a pronounced city accent, it was clear to Yana he had never lived in the countryside and would be ignorant of the ritual taking place around them. The 5 other soldiers were still on horseback, slumped under their cloaks while the rain ran off them in rivulets. Even their horses looked miserable, their heads lowered and their eyes downcast. Barring their way was a man with the leathery skin and the angular body of those who had worked in fields all their lives. Yana knew a farmer when she saw one, and she knew the young man next to him to be his son by his simple, striking resemblance. Both wore straw hats, the rims sagging with moisture. The father kept his mouth fixed in a thin line, his jaw muscles flexing in a display of stubbornness, while his son shifted from foot to foot, his eyes on the swords and spears of the soldiers. "This man says the rains have caused the river to flood. The rushing waters have undermined the bridge to Scottsdale. He suggested we turn back and stay the night in Whistleby, the town we passed a few leagues back," the captain said. "There is no inn here in this town?" she asked. "It has been closed for months," the farmer volunteered. "Of course it has been," she thought. She made her way past the line of soldiers, touching the horses on their flanks and their neck, as was her habit, and stood before the farmer. His cheek twitched, and despite the rain, he removed his hat, holding it with both hands, and elbowed his son until he did the same. He recognized her as a lady, and would know her as a noble by her escort, yet she was loath to use her new title and the authority that came with it on country people she saw as her own. "Good eve, kind sir," she said. "It is good of you to brave the elements to warn us of danger." She hoped her Rivertown accent and manner would put him at ease. His shoulders lowered, and an apologetic grimace worked its way into his face. "We're sorry it has inconvenienced a lady of your stature." His hands twisted the brim of his hat. It was a delicate dance Yana had to make next, and she lowered her voice so that the soldiers would not hear her words. "And I am sorry for the loss your village has experienced," she said, letting her eyes dart in the direction of the nearest doorway. Son looked to father, surprise in his eyes. The father made his lips into a thin line once more and nodded. "Thank you, my lady." "My men are cold, wet, and weary. We have travelled many days. To reach our destination of the city tonight is our humble wish. Where is your chief? Perhaps I may speak with him to discuss passage or boarding in town for the night." "He is ahead at the bridge, my lady." She thanked him with a bow, holding her cloak closed over her chest, and returned to the carriage where she opened the door, reached in for her sword, and buckled it around her waist. "My lady, is there something you need?" the captain asked, coming up beside her. "A sword, a horse, and a lie," she thought. "Yes, Captain. Let's start with your horse." Yana felt better on a horse rather than being pulled by them. The mare responded too, lifting her head and turning her ears to this new rider who guided her with gentler and more certain hands than the captain she was accustomed to. Yana cantered down the road, leaving behind the shuttered houses and passing under the boughs of the forest. The trees were astir with wind, leaves spinning free from their summer perches to tumble across the road, landing in puddles that rippled with raindrops and moonlight. The bridge itself was not hard to find, plastered with yellow leaves from an overhanging maple. The chief was not so easily seen. He blended in well with the tree he leaned up against, and it was not until he took a step forward that Yana even noticed him or the spear, taller than himself, that he let stand beside him. His face was beardless, and relatively young for a chief. His features were long and narrow, but not unhandsome. "It is said," Yana began without preamble, "that a rich lady once wished not to wet her skirts fording a stream like this, so lure him, the god of tricks, appeared and offered to build a bridge for her. In exchange, he would claim the life of the first person to set foot upon it. She agreed. Lurim arranged stones into her bridge, knowing that her husband was on his way home and would be the next to cross it. Seeing her husband coming, she called a beggar to her side. Then she tossed a gold coin across the bridge so that the beggar followed after. Lurim, furious, was forced to claim the beggar's life, and the rich man lived and prospered. As the rich often do, the man said in a neutral tone. Yana was quiet, still waiting for more on his part. She saw the white of his teeth flash in a smile. You wind on like a Carathian, traveller. I practically am. I am a river towner. Your accent says so, but I would not rush to make you Carathian just yet. River towners are a breed unto themselves. Thank you. She bowed her head. What brings you to Scottsdale Bridge on such a night? An escort, actually of the King's men. We wish to reach the city before daybreak, but we have been stopped short because we are told the bridge has become unstable. Aye, by my orders. I am the chief of this town, Faven Marks, and I have barred crossing, for your own safety. May I ask who my address? Be it enough to know I am your friend, Faven. You may call me Yana. Well, Yana of Rivertown, your best scramble would be to turn back towards Whistleby Town, about a league back. There will be an inn there where you will find rest. We are 7, good sir, with horses and carriage. The roads are not kind tonight. You offer us no room in your own town? A town is full of travellers who also wish to cross to Scottsdale. That is the story your men tell us, and loyal men they are. But the lintels of your houses say something different. He was silent. She saw his fingers flex and readjust on his spear. The wind hissed in the newly bare tree branches above. A leaf peeled off the bridge. I cannot be responsible for the superstitions of a few ignorant folk, he said. Interesting, the few ignorant folk occupy every house along the main avenue. She felt that she was backing him into a corner and wished not for him to respond as of yet. Let me tell you a different story, Faven. I have introduced myself as a friend, and I remain so in this telling. It is a story of a village where a spirit child, an infant whose spirit was not long in the world, left for the next shortly after birth, has passed away. Anyone who has had a grandmother who was prone to winding on, and I have yet to meet one who does not, will tell you that such spirit children must be buried in safe places, where their graves will not be disturbed, for there are grave robbers who may want to reach the graves again. For some believe that even in death these children's spirits possess powers that the living might use, for healing or prophesying, perhaps. There are also those who believe that in the wake that this child dies, elderberry must be placed in the doorways of the homes in the village where the child lived. Elderberry, a berry that is at first sweet, but in the after-tasting sour, to a spirit says, this place is friendly to you, but you should move on. She stopped, the clouds of breath dispersing from before her face. She could understand the plan of these people. Bury the child in the forest in some unmarked place where no one would ever think to look. Even now, she imagined they had set the body in the cold earth, and the old grandmothers were standing under drawn shawls reciting charms and incantations over the grave. Faven was still silent. His lips remained pressed shut, but his eyes told her she was correct. Yana leaned down in her saddle. I have nothing to say towards what you and your people believe or do not believe. It is no business of mine. But I tell you this in good faith, that the men with me are men of the city, yet I am sure there must be one of them who might see the elderberry as I did. They might not know its full meaning, but they will know what it is related to. These are an offish lot, and they are tired and cold. At best, they will ridicule you. At worst, they will call the inquisitors to censure and fine you, for you know the laws that remain on the books. Let us pass. I will make sure they stick to the road.
Unless you are burying the child in the centre of the trade route, which I highly doubt, there will be no interference from these men with the ceremony that I'm sure is underway. Tired as they are, they will not even detect it.
Faven nodded. There was a lucid look in his eye and a candid expression on his face. You speak with honesty, as I hope a friend might, Yonna, and respect for our circumstances. I would not expect as much from city travellers, but definitely a river towner. For that, you and your guard may pass as long as you can assure me you will not be stopping or straying.
I assure you.
Ride slowly back to the village. I regret making your men delay further, but in that time, I will run ahead to make sure there is nothing for your men to stumble upon. Now Yonna nodded. And Yonna from Rivertown, may I be so bold as to ask who travels to the castle with an escort of so many and an emissary like yourself?
I do, Faven.
She drew her sword and held the hilt towards him, her thumb on the intricate engraving at the base of the blade. A P with an A leaning into its stem.
You will see it is a Pathos original. Only council elders and generals carry such blades. This escort delivered this one to me. I am Yonna Yonnasale, most newly elected member of the Council of Elders.
As she expected, and still was not comfortable with, Faven took to his knee. She could detect a nervous tremor to his voice now.
Well, I see tonight that the arm of the law has been gracious, my lady. Please rise, Faven. I addressed you as a friend, and you granted me passage as a friend, not as an elder. I will remember that. You are the gracious one.
He bowed.
I will ride back slowly now,
she said.
As you asked. The escort will be following soon.
Safe journey, my lady. You have gained the loyalty of Innisgate town, he said, then disappeared over the crest of the bridge.
And a friend,
she thought. Chapter 2. The Boy in Bindings. 2 night guards leaned into the door of the castle keep, and Yonna stepped into the entry hall just as the thunder was beginning to rumble again. A lady in waiting, her eyes puffy with sleep, greeted her. She began a curtsy but left it only half complete, the thunder flustering her.
Your ladyship, I am Deirdre. Welcome to Anta's castle. I will notify the other elders of your arrival. No need to wake them. If you could just show me to my chambers,
she said, shaking the rain from her cloak.
Of course. We have a fire already laid there for you. The boys will light it. Do you require any refreshment? Something hot, cider, and anything you have left from dinner.
Deirdre raised her eyebrows. Yonna wondered if she had already broken etiquette.
We can make a fresh meal for you, my lady, she said. Deirdre, I'd be asleep before they finished. Just said some rye and cheese.
The passages on the first floor smelled of the mud tracked in by visitors, but as they climbed to the second, third, and finally the 4th story, mud gave way to the scent of wood fires and lantern oil. The chamber boys had been quick to their tasks. A fire was already burning in her chambers, and her bag was set on the floor. As Deirdre shut the door, another clap of thunder caused her to jump and clutch her hand to her breast. Halfway into the hall, she turned, as if to listen for something, then shut the door overly hard behind her.
Strange,
Yonna thought. She turned to explore her chambers. She was in an anteroom, with a desk, bookshelves, and most importantly, the fire. Doors on either side led to additional rooms, but her attention was drawn towards the fire. There was an iron drying arm hinged on the hearth, which she drew out and stretched her cloak across. She would change the rest of her clothes after the food came, which it promptly did, carried in on a silver tray by a winsome-looking chamber boy. Next to the loaf of bread and block of cheese, slices of apple fanned out over a saucer, a nice touch by the chef. She gave the boy an apple and thanked him. He shut the door behind him, and she opened her bag, changed into a sleeping gown, then wrapped herself in a blanket folded at the foot of the bed. She sat down cross-legged on the hearth. Not a very dignified position for an elder, she thought, snapping an apple slice in her teeth. She began tearing at the bread and taking long draws of hot cider. She was feeling human again. Lightning flashed, its light slicing through the closed shutters of the nearest window. Thunder followed. She put her mug down and listened. She sat still for what seemed like 5 minutes, not moving a muscle. The only sounds, the fire crackling and the raindrops pelting her window. The lightning flashed again, then thunder. Then she heard what she was listening for. A scream. It sounded like a baby's cry. She listened again, the bread she had stopped chewing turning sour in her mouth. She swallowed, crossed to the door, and opened it. The sound drifted in like a ghost. Terrible wailing that would crescendo with every thunderclap. She stepped into the hall and closed the door behind her. The crying was from farther away than she had realized. Only the stridency made it sound close. She started down the hall, passing doors on both sides of her. Cursory glances at their keyholes revealed darkness on the other sides. Either the other residents slept without fires, or the rooms were uninhabited. She guessed the latter. No one could sleep with the noise of this child crying. The hall came to an end and she stood before a door, the other side the source of the noise. The cries were making her ears flutter with pain. She twisted the handle and pushed the door open just as a thunderclap drowned out the squeak of the hinges. The other side was bright, well lit, and warm. In the center of the room was a crib with high railings. Inside was the child. Not a baby, but a boy of at least 2, much too old to be crying so. Yana felt a wave of sympathy for the child, his face twisted in anguish. She stepped towards him. Despite his swollen eyes and red face, she could tell he was beautiful. She reached in to pick him up and was stopped abruptly. He was bound to the crib, leather straps wrapping around his wrists, which were chafed and red. By the scars there, she could see this was not a new arrangement. She untied the bindings and picked him up. It soothed him little. He reached not for her, but rather the window, which was closed with heavy shutters. He struggled so that she thought she might drop him. She startled as she turned and saw a figure sitting in the corner, an old woman asleep in a rocking chair. She assumed this was his minder. Yana walked over and called to her. Her chin was to her chest and she did not stir. Yana prodded her. The woman woke.
"What is the meaning of this?"
Yana said as the boy kicked and pushed at her.
"My lady,"
the woman said, assuming Yana was a noble or elder.
"Why has this child been left so?"
The woman stared at her for a moment, saying nothing. Yana was becoming impatient.
"I'm sorry, I'm hard of hearing,"
she said, cupping her hand to her ear with an apologetic smile. Yana sighed and raised her voice.
"Why is this child tied to his bed like so?" "The prince is always tied so, in case he suffers one of his seizures." "The prince?"
"Yes."
Yana considered the boy crying in her arms, wondering if she had overstepped her bounds.
"Does the king know of this?"
"The child is the king's woe, for the prince reminds him of the wife he lost."
Yana sighed. She was well familiar with the tragedy of losing Queen Aersale. It was said some Carathians in the city still wore black armbands in mourning for her, 3 years since her death.
"There must be a better solution than tying him to the crib. His wrists are rubbed raw. Does the king not listen to reason?"
"He does not listen to anyone during such storms. He retires into his chambers, into his thoughts. His wife died in such a storm while her son was born. It is why he was given a name that bears the bite of the storm. Haille."
Haille Hillbourne, the invalid prince, the king's woe, Talamar's bane.
"And you just sit here asleep while he bleeds on his bindings?"
The woman shrugged.
"There is no consoling him during the storms that torment him."
"Who hired you?"
Yana asked.
Lady Migdal,
she said with an air of self-importance that told Yana that Lady Migdal was a person of some standing.
Well, you are relieved of your duties for the night.
By whose authority, I might ask, my lady?
Yana of Riv...
She stopped short and started again.
Lady Yana Sale, newly appointed elder.
The woman stood up and gave a shallow bow.
Yet to be in council, though.
You may consider it my first act as council member to relieve you.
You will find few others willing to care for him, he cries so.
By the noise of the boy, Yana realized the old woman was right. Perhaps the fact that she was hard of hearing was an advantage. Yana's disposition softened.
What kind of kingdom is this that cares so little for this baby?
He is 3 years old, my lady. He is no baby.
He is small for 3.
The woman continued, as if not hearing her, as if his size was a fact she was long aware of and deserved no comment.
The people fear he is an imbecile in addition to an invalid.
He suffers the shaking sickness?
Indeed. The nobles resent this boy. They feel their own children would be better heirs.
Then in fairness they will be if he is unfit. That is the purpose of the king's council.
Perhaps. One cannot tell. Shall I take him from you, madam?
No, I shall care for him myself tonight.
The woman could not hide her smile.
Perhaps you are used to noble women of the court,
Yana said.
Well, we from Rivertown do things differently.
Now the woman's eyes shone with what was clearly mischief.
So you do. You will ruffle not a few feathers. Not a few.
Now her mouth opened in a smile of affection. She wheezed with a soft laugh.
The staff know where to find me if you decide to request my help again. Just ask for Roslyn. In the meantime, this old woman will get some sleep.
She placed a set of knitting needles and a ball of yarn in a wicker basket, covered it with a cloth, and shuffled out into the hall. Her steps were slow, and her shoulders crooked at an angle. Thunder crashed, and Haille began to cry again. Yana cooed and brushed the hair on his head with her hand. But nothing seemed to placate him. Tired and weary, Yana realized she had already taken on too much for herself. She found emotions stirring within her. Resentment, impatience, anger, even grief. Haille cried more loudly in her ear. She was seized with the desire to cover his mouth while he reached for the window just as the shutters were outlined in a flash of lightning. Odd that he did not recoil from the noise but rather was drawn to it. She carried him over, close enough that the spray of the drops hitting the outside and seeping through cracks in the shutters touched his face. He immediately became quieter, taking deep breaths, recovering himself. It was as if he'd suddenly been placed into the arms of one he loved. Curious. Now she took a firm hold of him, putting her hand under his shirt and twisting the material about in her forearm. Certain that he could not break away, she undid the latches and opened the shutters. She found that these were only interior shutters. Another pair, more weathered and worn, waited on the outside of the window. These outer shutters let a considerable amount of rain through. The sill was already soaking wet, but despite it, she settled onto the ledge. Haille had gone quiet. He no longer struggled, but strangely enough pressed himself against her and began to yawn. His hair became matted and wet from the rain, but he did not shiver. Yana did, however, and she got up to quickly look for a cloak or wrap. There were none in the room, and Haille immediately struggled for the window again. She readjusted her grip on his shirt and focused on her search. The room was a nursery, filled with toys, clothes, and blankets. They were small blankets, child size, but they would do. She took 3, wrapped one about Haille, and then sat down on the sill again, wrapping one about her legs, the other about her shoulders. Haille fell into a peaceful sleep. The cold wind, heavy with moisture, blew in on them, and the boy snuggled and whimpered happily. Yana was not completely uncomfortable. It had been years since she had sat and watched a storm blow itself through in full. When she had worked on river barges, floating along the trade route between Falham and Rivertown, she'd always found a sheltered place above deck to watch storms roll overhead. In from the Eastlands, and across the Dreaded Harn, to the feet of the Rimker Mountains. The prince's body was warm against hers, his head resting on her breasts. This was dangerous, she knew. The loss of her own daughter was still so fresh. Becoming attached to this boy of unknown temperament was a risk. She closed and opened her eyes, rewrapped one of the blankets and turned her gaze towards the city lights. They were reflected in 1,000 puddles so that a second city shimmered in pools while orbits of ripples spread outward. She hummed a simple little tune for Haille. Lorna, Yana's mentor, had always said that Yana had a beautiful singing voice. She had hoped to sing for her own child, Shariel, her name chosen in the womb but never whispered lovingly to her face. The thought ripped through Yana unexpectedly, and tears ran down her face. If she cried, it did not matter now. Her tears would mix with the raindrops. She stared out the window, letting the tears fall, and whispered to herself,
"Welcome to Antis."
Chapter 3. Haille Hillbourne.
When a wolf is alone, separated from his pack, he's two things,
said the trapper.
lost and mad.
Lost and mad,
The shortish man with jug ears and flat nose said, waving his arms and clawing at the air with his fingers to the delighted shrieks of the children. Haille was not delighted. He was not even scared like most of the Antons gathered in the bell yard down at the bottom of Castle Hill. Nor was he relieved, as many of the farmers stepping over muddy wagon ruts must have felt seeing the wolf caught and caged. Its foreleg was nearly broken in two by the trap that had snapped close on it, the skin peeled back to reveal shiny bone. The animal was mad with pain, snapping its jaws loudly and crashing its teeth up against the bars of its cage. A few brave boys Haille's age poked at it with sticks. The trap dragged heavily as the wolf lunged at them, its eyes wild, senseless. Afraid. It was difficult for Haille to name exactly what he was feeling as he watched the crowd let the boys taunt the wolf. He felt as if a poison infiltrated his body, filling his organs with a dark, unpleasant stickiness, just like the filth that flowed in the unpaved city streets. Foul, malodorous filth. The feeling only grew stronger with each jab on the part of the boys. One succeeded in stabbing the end of his stick in the eye of the wolf, leaving a red, weeping socket. The trapper, a thick man with a beard shaved into a point that reached just the tip of his chin, chased the boys away as he and his companions, other fierce-looking hunters and trappers, converged on the cage with long spears. The wolf turned its attack towards them, its gums bloody and teeth breaking as it threw itself against the bars with wild growls. With little fanfare, the trapper with the pointed beard lowered his spear and caught the wolf in the chest on its next lunge. The growls turned into a yelp that echoed in the bell yard. The sight of the creature hung up on the spear brought the crowd to cheers. The trapper held a hand up in triumph, leaving only one on the spear. The wolf was not finished. It twisted to the side, pulling the lance with it. The handle wanged against the bars and knocked the trapper over into the mud. The people gasped as he fell close to the cage. His jug-eared assistant offered him his hand but found it slapped away. The trapper nodded to the other men, and they all stabbed their spears through the cage. The animal's countenance changed from fierce to fearful as one blade after another tore its flesh. The wolf was overcome and stumbled, its legs scraping the bottom of the cage as it twisted against the spears. Blood was not only on its leg but matted in its fur now, its one remaining eye cast down at the ground. It moved as best it could on its three good legs to shake free, But it only brought itself to the leader, who with a red face and porcine nostrils opening wide, drove his spear into the wolf's throat. The final blow twisted into the animal's neck, tenting the skin on the far side before the red blade burst forth. The wolf collapsed, its chest heaving. The crowd was in a frenzy. One could have been forgiven for thinking a cadre of knights had just returned from battle tossing out coin and treasure. The spoils of war. That would have been a reason to celebrate. Haille felt sick, and even worse, in this feeling, he knew he was alone. He had already turned back up Lancel Way when the bell tower was striking 1:45. The midday break was nearly over and he had to steel himself for another half-day of tutelage alongside other students. Students of rich merchants, noble families, and high houses. Students who would never let themselves be seen among such commoners that packed the bell-yard. Not that they would be welcome. Haille had stuffed his own academy surcoat into his satchel. It would be wrinkled when he put it back on at the academy house, but he did not care. He could hardly make Master Catham or Madame Havisham like him any less. He already had shown them contempt by drawing in his notebooks, arriving late, and wearing riding breeches under his surcoat. And if they knew where he went during his breaks, they would have been even more contemptuous. It did not matter. He had never felt much fellowship from those lucky enough to sit above the salt at the table, so he did not waste time worrying about them. They could be packed in a cage, taunted and stabbed for all he cared. He valued his noonday wanderings for the very fact that they drew him down the hill from the castle and the high streets to where he was unknown. To where other boys of 14 years wore breeches patched at the knees and hawked in the streets or cleaned in the taverns, or if unlucky enough, worked in mines. Down the hill in the vicinity of the bell yard he could disappear and no one knew him as a Hillbourne. He was still feeling miserable. It was a cloudy day and the timbers of buildings were darkened from morning showers, deep puddles among the cobblestones of the high streets. But it was not the weather that had him ill at ease. He actually favored the briskness of autumn, the turning of leaves, and the clearing of fields for harvest. He liked to see the hay bursting out of the windows of barns and the gourds carved into faces of gods and lit from within with candles that families would set on their doorsteps for the harvest moon festival. He even welcomed the rains of winter, for they kept others indoors and left the outdoors more open to him to explore. For some reason he had always preferred a rainy day to a sunny one. Thunder and lightning was all the better. No, it was the slaughter of the wolf that still unsettled him so, even if he did not know why. Perhaps only because it had been so violent, the animal suffering so prolonged. He considered it a waste of a good woodland creature. Damn the farmers if they grazed their flocks too close to Worthern Forest. Whatever the case, his usual break from the unpleasantness of Academy House had been ruined. Haille caught sight of another sky-blue surcoat with the gold insignia of a key and torch on the front and back and groaned. A fellow classmate. He could not identify whom exactly, for the hood was up, but Haille thought it best to act preemptively. When his classmate passed him at a sprint, not taking notice of him, Haille put out his foot and tripped him. He let out a harsh laugh as the younger student spilled forward onto the cobblestones. With a loud huff, the air forced out of his chest. Haille felt no regret. After all, the likelihood that even this smaller underclassman had thrown melon rinds at him, called him an invalid or imbecile, or found some other way of humiliating him was high. He kept walking and only stopped when he glanced back and realized his mistake. He was a she, and not an underclassman at all, but someone from his own class. Katlyn Barnes. Somehow he had picked the one student who likely never had teased him. "Damn it, Katlyn, I'm sorry," he said, reaching down to help her up. Her hands were raw and scraped, and she yanked them out from his reach. At first he thought she was just afraid of catching the shaking sickness from him. But when he saw the hurt in her face, he knew she was not scared, but angry. Her eyes were gray, in such a way that reminded him of the coat of the wolf he had just seen slaughtered. Her hair was a russet brown, like dried blood.
Katlyn, I'm sorry. I thought you were somebody else, she said, wheezing slightly as she picked herself up. Anybody else. I just sometimes have to stick up for myself. It's a constant struggle between me and the other kids. Of course, I know. I've heard them, she said, standing, rubbing her hands on her dress, a homespun wool one with patches. The same one she wore every day. Haille was seized with an idea. He reached into his satchel, removed a gold capinha, and held it out to her. As soon as he saw her face, he regretted it. Take it, he said. I don't want to flash it around on the street like this. Not only did she not take it, but she struck his hand, knocking it to the ground where it rolled, wobbled, and plunked into a puddle. The face of the founder of Antis, Haille's own ancestor, Haille Hillbourne, glared back at Haille, distorted, and shadowed by floating bits of dirt and grime. When he looked up, Katlyn was already running again. Avenger Red, the vigilante of the Eastlands, frees 24 more child slaves from dastardly slavers, the news crier outside the academy yard called out just as Haille returned. At least there is some good news, he thought, stepping through the gate and into the academy's courtyard. He would have remained to listen for more details on the city's favorite vigilante, but the crier had already moved on to the news of the fearsome wolf that had been put to death in the bell yard. Haille straightened his surcoat over his shoulders as he stepped over the chalk drawings scratched into the flagstones by the youngest children. He passed a few children on punishment who had been ordered to sweep the doorway of dust, an unending task, and made his way to his classroom. He was late and had hoped to slip in the back without being noticed. But Madame Havisham was standing in the doorway berating Katlyn Barnes, her head bowed, her eyes to the floor. "You are late! Your cloak is dirty, and your hands are unsightly. This is not what is expected of a lady." Ladies didn't wear wool dresses with patches either, but Madame Havisham knew that could not be helped. Everyone in the school knew Katlyn was an orphan but a generally good student. Haille did not want that ruined on his account. His standing as a miscreant was already firmly established. "She's late because of me," he said. "I tripped her." Madame Havisham pursed her lips, her eyebrows like bushy caterpillars lifted up on her face. "Well, such behavior is hardly fitting for a prince." "I understand," Haille said, more amenable than usual. Madame Havisham's eyebrows rose even further, so unused to Haille's cooperation. "Well, your mantle is a wrinkled mess." "I'll agree to do any lines you expect of me," he said, walking to his seat in the back row. He pulled his chair out with his foot and settled down into it. Madame Havisham followed him. He would not escape her fury so easily. "Truancy is one thing, bullying another, but frankly I find your careless attitude most objectionable, Mr. Hillbourne. No, in this case I think I'll be calling on Lady Yonasail for a discussion after tutelage today." Haille's throat fluttered and he slumped down in his chair. Lines he was used to. Sweeping the courtyard, carrying wood, and hauling water too. But calling on Yana was different. He did not like to disappoint her, and he knew that this time she would be upset with him. Martin Forts snickered at Haille from the front row but quieted the moment Madame Havisham turned her head. Haille, picking up his quill and starting his lesson, wished he had tripped Martin instead. His day only got worse at 3 when his class crossed the campus to Reed Hall and Haille found his trunk broken into and his practice sword snapped in half. He stared at the 2 pieces laying across his pads, aware that his classmates dressing just behind him were likely the ones to have broken it and were watching him for a reaction. Could have been any of them. Could have been all of them. It was a sight he'd grown used to. It was like so many other little humiliations, like the word cripple scratched onto his desk, or children grimacing and shaking behind the teachers' backs, imitating him during one of his episodes. Except that breaking his practice sword stripped him of the one joy that he looked forward to in the day. It was in the fencing ring where he could free his mind and compete with his classmates on a level playing field. He closed the trunk slowly, careful not to slam it, and walked out of the changing room. No one said a word.
Not even Martin Fort's, which was for the best, for Haille's restraint was at a breaking point. Haille was first to take a seat on the edge of the ring, without pads. He clenched his jaw and willed himself not to cry when Ivan Greenwolf, the sword instructor, knelt down beside him. Haille looked away. Ivan was one of the only allies he had in the academy, and his sympathy might be the soft point that would break down Haille's defenses. Ivan must have realized this and punched his arm hard. "No pads, Mr. Hillbourne. Should I punish you?" "I'm already doing lines after class today." "You should have excellent penmanship by now." Ivan gave a slight smile. "Should. Maybe I will make you run sprints. Go change." "My sword is broken." Haille just stared at the ground. "You need a better lock." "I'll say." The first of the other boys was emerging from the changing room. "I think we will run sprints today," Ivan said. "They'll be sorry they got you kicked out of class." "What am I doing instead?" "Go help teach the younger classes. Go now, so the other boys don't see you moping." Haille couldn't suppress a smile. There was some justice in the world after all. Chapter 4. Fathers and Kings. Haille leapt upwards and slapped the outstretched arm of a statue in the garden on his way to the east wing where the younger children practiced fencing. A bird flew off the crest of Reed Hall, and for a moment he thought it may have been one of his jays. However, it flew off in the opposite direction. Just an ordinary robin. The day seemed full of promise once more. He could already hear Master Ivan calling on the boys in his own class to run wind sprints. He smiled, kicking the mud from his shoes in the entryway of the next hall over, and pushed open the paneled door on a room full of boys dwarfed by their own practice blades. An hour of helping the youngsters work on their footing, their blocks, and their thrusts took Haille's mind off the day's previous grief. Only in moments when the boys broke for water did he still see the wolf in his mind's eye. He shut it away and instead savored the continuing pounding of feet in the next hall over as Ivan drilled his classmates. The younger students took well to his lessons. After time on the basics, he focused them on a few more advanced movements and then let them spar freestyle, praising them for attempting the techniques they had just learned, despite their mistakes. He liked the youngsters. They were obedient and respectful, more afraid of him because he was a prince than because of his affliction. Not a single one recoiled at his touch when he helped them position their arms for a block. No one whispered "invalid" behind his back. Most didn't even know of his affliction, and when one asked him about the leather pallet around his neck, indented with half-moon marks of his own teeth, he dismissed it as something he was required to wear, and no further questions followed. They were more interested in learning a sliding down block from him. To them, I am nearly normal. When the class was over, he was grateful he did not need to change in the dressing room. He watched with no small amount of satisfaction as his classmates trudged off to remove their pads. Bent at the waist, their swords drooping, their clothes soaked through with sweat. Eager to avoid them altogether, he ran back to Academy House to get his satchel. There was still light enough left in the day that he could go to the forest and feed the jays. He still had a pouch of breadcrumbs from the kitchen stuffed in his satchel from that morning. But he stopped in the doorway when he entered the lecture hall. The room was familiar to him. So was Madame Havisham, the benches, and the desks. After all, he saw this same scene every day of the week for moons on end. But seeing Yana Sale, the fixture of his home life, amid the people and things of his academy life, was wrong. She wore a lavender surcoat cinched with a man's belt over riding pants and boots. Her red hair fell in graceful flowing curls to rest on her hood. Normally, on any other occasion, he would have been happy to see her, but not now when she wore such an expression of disappointment, her lips a flat line of barely contained anger. "Behavior not befitting his station," Madame Havisham said in a caustic, nasal tone. Yana glared at him across the room. "Certainly not," she said. She stood, smoothing the folds of her surcoat over the place where her sword usually hung. Her steps were light, like a dancer, her gait swift and sweeping, as if she were eager to quit the room, the company of Haille's instructor, and even Haille himself. Still, she paused before the doorway and turned back to Madame Havisham.
Thank you, madam. I assure you I will attend to him.
Haille raked his lower lip with his teeth. Attending to him took the form of stepping past him in the doorway without as much as a glance. Haille knew better than not to follow. He snatched his satchel from the back of his chair and ran into the corridor. Jonna was already descending the stairs to the main courtyard. He was glad that most of the students had been dismissed for the day. It was embarrassing when one's minders had to be called in. Jonna's horse, Grey Wind, was waiting for her. She didn't mount but led the mare by the reins out of the gate at a quick clip. Haille continued in their wake, his hand twisting the strap of his satchel. As they passed Beecham Avenue and the path leading to the forest, he ventured to say, "I thought perhaps we would feed the jays today." Jonna turned on him. She slapped his face. "You know better!" His skin burned everywhere. His cheek stung. It was a pain that reached deep within him, for disappointing Jonna was punishment in itself. "I'm sorry. An orphan. Katlyn, whatever her name is. I thought she was someone else. You are the one saying I have to stick up for myself. That is what a man does. A man protects those that are weaker than he. You are mistaken if that is the only lesson of manhood you have taken from me. Be strong. Don't be weak. Be strong to be kind. Man is not measured by his brawn only, but how he can love and be loved by others. Look at your father." Haille snorted, his own temper flaring with a dizzy rush to his head. "For all the love he shows me." Jonna winced. All she could muster was, "Your father is loved by the people." Haille had a ready retort for her again. "And we know that love does not extend to me. I'm tired of having to stand up for myself, for being the object of their scorn, their resentment." Her throat flared. He could see her resistance breaking down. For as much as Jonna was angry at him, he knew her love for him was greater. No one understood his plight better. But if she was going to relent now, she showed no further signs. "Haille, I won't stand here and listen to you quip about being a victim. You must be better than that." She turned her back on him and led Grey Wind away in the direction of the castle gate, her shoed hooves clopping on the cobblestones. A wagon passed between them. Haille realized he had, without thinking, reached into his bag and wrapped his hand around the pouch of breadcrumbs he had hoped to share with the Blue Jays. He yanked it free of the satchel and flung it in a fluid motion into the side of the wagon. It burst, sending a rain of crumbs onto the cobblestones below. He went to his room after that, and he realized the Jays were not ready to let him off so easy. The three of them were waiting on his windowsill, chirping behind the glass panes, three bobbing masses of feathers. He unlatched the window and swung it open. Sion, the boy of the trio, swooped in and alighted on the bedpost. Sapphire waited on the sill, preening her feathers, while Azure leapt to Haille's fingers and perched there. "I'm sorry, friends, but I threw away the breadcrumbs I had saved for you. Blame my temper." Azure reproached him with a sharp chirp. Sapphire was aloof. It never ceased to amaze him how much she lived into her namesake. The only jay he had named for a jewel, she was haughty and vain, constantly preening her feathers. However, being a female, her plumage could not equal that of her brother, Sion, who was indifferent to his own appearance. He was as foolhardy and as adventurous as any little brother with two sisters to look after him might be. Even now he was bouncing along the floor next to the door, searching for crumbs. "You better be careful, Sion. If a guard sees you, he is likely to snare you for dinner," Haille said as Azure hopped onto his shoulder. She, the big sister of the trio, or so Haille imagined. In keeping with her responsible role, she fluttered away from Haille to dive at her brother and herd him back to the safety of the window. Not to be left out, Sapphire took up a place on Haille's knee as he sat down on the sill. He looked past all three of them to Worthern Forest, where they lived, his eyes roving north over the spear-shaped trees and to the ridges lifting into a sky the color of steel. The sun, low in its afternoon track, was a milky disk to the west. It would not be long, though, before it broke beneath the lowest clouds to tint the earth with the tea-colored light of evening before dropping below the horizon completely. He looked the length of the castle wall and noticed the window to his father's chamber swing open. He would have thought it a cleaner, but no one raised a hand with a rag to wipe it. It must have been his father who had opened it.
Best to get it over with sooner rather than later, he thought, releasing the jays to soar out over the battlements back to the woods. What a strange sight he must have been, sitting in the window daily with the jays, in full view of the guards, the castle nobility, cleaners, servants, cooks, and their like. High or low-born, he could imagine what they thought of him. The invalid prince. The cursed child. He was willing to bet that many who had seen him there in his window had wished for him to fall to his death. What they didn't realize were all the times he had thought of jumping. A darkness settled over his heart. A curtain pulled against the sun and a familiar sadness set in. He was about to see his father. The guards at either side of the door made efficient nods as Haille approached his father's chambers. He mumbled a "good eve" to them, never quite comfortable with the obligatory deference the castle vassals showed him. He'd done nothing to earn it except be born, and he knew from spying on their conversations how they mocked him for his sickness and blamed him for his mother's death. He was surprised to hear Yonna's voice from beyond the door. Apparently she had already decided to turn him into his father, but after a few moments he realized he had assumed wrong, for her tone was more of pleading than of scolding. "He is shunned," she said.
"Every child of privileges. I was until I could earn the respect of my fellow classmates. It's a rite of passage."
"He is not shunned for privilege, but for his affliction."
"There is nothing to be done about that." Haille heard his father settling into his chair, the joints creaking. Although he could not see him, Haille could picture him perfectly. Countless times he had sat across from the king, the round table of his study between them. Yonna had known Talimar all his life. She had also known Haille's mother. After Airsole's death, Haille's father had invited Yonna to join the Council of Elders not only because her own municipality, Rivertown, had grown and merited representation, but he valued someone who knew him and would speak truth to power. Yonna had never disappointed.
"But he is still blamed for his mother's death."
The room was stifled by silence. No one spoke to his father of his mother. Talimar was quick to demonstrate why.
"I have asked you not to bring that tragedy up."
Yonna was not cowed.
"Isn't it time you moved past her death?"
"And the people won't forgive me. So popular she was. I still see some old women wearing black cowls for her."
"They don't blame you, but your son," she repeated. "Each day he bears that burden. Your own continued mourning does not alleviate the situation. Your mourning robes cast a shadow over not just you, but your son as well."
Silence hung in the room for a long while before his father said in a voice thick with emotion,
"Have I been dwelling on my grief so long?"
Haille, sensing his father's vulnerability, dismissed the guards with a flick of his wrist. They obeyed, moving to stand at either end of the hallway. Haille continued to listen.
"How is it for him?"
his father asked.
"Difficult, my liege," she said.
How do you think it would be for any child who had to wear a pallet around his neck? The other children ridicule him. Adults ridicule him. He has become hardened to survive it. He's disrespectful and intractable with his teachers, and he's picking fights with the other children now in an effort to preempt others. I don't want him turning into a bully. He couldn't be one with his size. He takes after his mother's diminutive nature. I've made sure he can defend himself.
She had, Haille reflected. It was Yonna's additional lessons on fighting, with weapons or without, that had placed him ahead of his peers in at least his fencing classes. The skills had served him well, but the thought reminded him of just why Yonna was so angry with him in the first place.
Strength's purpose is to be used to protect and prepare. A man's worth is judged by how much he loves and is loved.
It was one of the axioms she had made him repeat as he had drilled his thrusts, sweeps, and blocks in the forest clearing where they practiced in secret. He did know better.
But Yonna, if I were to believe you in all things, you would have convinced me half the kingdom is treasonous.
Not treasonous, but untrustworthy. You will always be surrounded by politics.
But conspiracies involving Annabeth Chastain? She is a loyal supporter.
She is loyal to herself.
Some might say you are threatened by her desire to join the council.
Your problem, my liege, is that you are too virtuous. When you always tell the truth, it is harder to see the lies of others. The people love you for it, but it will be someone closer to you who slips the knife into your back.
Politics are a distraction, especially when my son...
Heir Solis son too.
I know that.
Then honor him as you honor her. She would want a better life for him, a better father.
Haille heard his father inhale. He could picture him, his jaw working, his brow furrowed, his hand rubbing across the whiskers on his cheeks. Need I remind you of your place, Lady Yonasale? His father was retreating into the shell of his authority, his second favorite defense after his own self-pity. But Yona was not one to placate him.
My liege, I can forgive you for being blind to your enemies, but I plead you not to be blind to those who love you.
His father did not respond as Yona stood up, her own chair scraping across the floor.
I'll leave you to your thoughts.
That would be best. Haille, hearing her turn to the doorway, darted across the hall to the library where he hid behind the open door until Yona's footsteps receded around the corner. When he emerged, his father's door banged shut, the lock clipping into place. Chapter 5. Punishment. Night mist still hung over the battlements when Haille crossed the courtyard to the gatehouse the next morning. Only the scullery servants were about, carrying wood for the fires and water for the cisterns. A cock was crowing somewhere in the stables, but none of the horses were whickering yet for their morning feed. The guards at the drawbridge huddled, red-eyed, around a brazier sipping cups of tea, an hour to wait before they were relieved by the next shift. They did not salute Haille as he passed. Wrapped in a cloak, his hood over his head, his identity was obscured and he could pass as just another teenage boy. A curt, "Good morn," was all they offered without distancing themselves from the warmth of the brazier. Haille appreciated the indifference. At least it was honest. Yona herself had woken him that morning with a reminder of the punishment Madame Havisham and she had decided upon. Lines, as usual, but this time he would have to complete them in the library where he was also expected to help Master Gilbert with any tasks he required. Haille half expected the old man to be in bed himself, but when he entered the courtyard of Academy House, he saw a light flickering behind the stained glass window of the library. The front door was unlocked. The main hall was thick with the smell of leather folios, vellum, and beeswax candles. Master Gilbert was hunched over the fireplace, stoking the embers that had cooled in the night. The hall was still cold, and although Haille removed his cloak and hung it on the clothes tree in the corner, he left his scarf wrapped around his neck.
"My prince," Master Gilbert said, "help an old man, will you?"
"I understand my punishment requires it," Haille said, kneeling beside the librarian and helping him to arrange some kindling over the embers. They took turns blowing on the coals until the sticks smoldered and took light. Haille stacked a few logs on top. Master Gilbert's knees cracked as he moved to stand. Haille helped to steady him by his elbow.
"Your misfortune is my boon," the librarian said. "Oh, it is too cold yet to sit still and write lines, don't you think? Would you mind bringing in some more wood for me?"
"Of course," Haille said. He replaced his cloak on his shoulders, picked up the wood carrier, and went back outside. His breath was circling about his head as he reached the pole shed where the Academy's wood was stored. Once he had balanced a full load and trudged back across the grounds, the library was already brighter, as Master Gilbert had lit a number of candles and lanterns on walls and tables. The logs Haille had first put on the fire were crackling as he stacked the new wood on the hearth. Although menial, he preferred this work to sitting in a cold, stiff chair writing lines, and he was quick to respond when Master Gilbert called him to his desk and handed him a stack of oversized folios to reshelf. When Haille returned from the stacks, the main door swung open and a man in his 20s, a castle scribe, stepped inside, the candle flames dancing with the breeze of wind that followed him. Haille had seen him on occasion in the council hall of the castle, but he did not know his name. Master Gilbert met the scribe at the door, taking his hand in both of his, and the two of them shuffled down an aisle chatting together. Haille checked the fire, scraped the wax off the reading tables, topped off the inkwells, trimmed the quill points, And then with nothing left to do, he settled himself at one of the freshly cleaned tables with a sheet of parchment and began the first of the 1,000 lines he has been tasked to write. Strength is for protecting and preparation. A man's worth is judged by how much he loves and is loved. He began, the quill making a pleasant scratching noise as he wrote while the fire crackled and the voices of Master Gilbert and the scribe echoed off the vaulted ceiling. The drudgery of the task and the still fresh memory of his warm bed made Haille drowsy, and he was nodding off when one of the academy's scullery maids came in with a dented kettle of tea and hung it next to the fire. She left on her next errand without glancing at Haille. He helped himself to a steaming cup of tea and returned to his lines. In the next hour the darkness outside lightened, and the sound of other students arriving for the day drifted in from the courtyard. The classrooms were not yet open, and a number of students came to the library where they spread their books and began to study, or pretend to, as they whispered to one another and poured themselves cups of tea. Among them was Annabelle Chastain. She was wrapped in a black cloak with her family seal, a burgundy fox, embossed on the back. As the room warmed, she removed the cloak to reveal an immaculate white bodice that nearly glowed in the dim light. It was matched with a black, crushed velvet skirt, trimmed with a burgundy hem. She set her cloak on the back of her chair and sniffed the air in Haille's direction, her nose wrinkling as if some odor offended her. When she sat back down, she mumbled something just on the edge of hearing to her companions. The 3 other girls, all Haille's classmates, burst out laughing. Haille swallowed and the quill tip slipped and left a streak of ink alongside his lines. He was 2 lines further along when Master Gilbert called him back to his desk and handed him 2 more folios to reshelf. He did so, then stoked the fire and refilled his teacup before sitting back down at the table. The quill was in the inkwell where he left it, but the feather was turned in a direction he did not remember. None of his leaves of parchment were disturbed, but the uniformity of his lines was ruined. He stared at the words written in the middle of the page in flowing, looped script that only a girl could write. Haille is a freak. Queen killer. His knuckles were white around the handle of his mug. Annabelle and the girls were poring over their books, their heads lowered in a show of diligence that he knew to be contrived. His eyes tracked back and forth between his cup and Annabelle's white bodice. All the noises of the academy in the morning, the crackling fire, the clap of horses on the cobblestone courtyard, the opening and closing of the main door, Master Gilbert's whispers with his visiting scholars receded as if underwater while the sound of rushing blood filled Haille's ears. The surface of the tea in his hand rippled as he trembled. His world was reduced to the words on the page, the cup in his hand, and the growing impulse within him. So focused was he that he did not notice Master Ivan approach the table. The sword instructor called out 3 times before Haille realized he was saying his name. "Master Ivan." "Good morn," he said, placing his hand on Haille's shoulder while his eyes roved over the parchment. Ivan's age was difficult to calculate. His hair was closely cropped and silver, his face weathered and lined, but his body was lean. Haille had seen him beat knights in practice many years his junior, who had been foolhardy enough to challenge him in earnest. Haille was not sure if he came from a high family or not. Most of the instructors in the academy did, but Ivan wore no insignia, no crests denoting such status. His dress was proper, his doublet always stylish if subdued, lacking the lace or padding fashionable with some of the more wealthy aristocrats. He was always clean-shaven and his face characterized by a wry smile that never faded. If the words on the parchment offended him, he betrayed no sign. Instead, he squeezed Haille's shoulder and said, "Perhaps you might consider changing tables to a different alcove where you won't be disturbed." "Who will tend to the fire?" Haille asked. Ivan reached into the wood carrier, pitched 2 logs onto the flames and said, "Let it tend itself. Come." Haille slung his satchel over his shoulder, rolled his parchments and followed his instructor, balancing his quill in his inkwell. Ivan led him to the opposite end of the library. Far away from the hearth and the fire it was colder. Haille wished for his cloak but did not consider going back to where Annabelle and her friends sat. Ivan stopped at a table where a number of large folios were already opened. Pages of illuminated manuscripts stared up at the ceiling, the rich colors of the inks brilliant even in the dim morning light. Haille took in the rows of shelves around them.
These are books on the occult, magic, and superstition. I'm not allowed to be here.
You are with an instructor, Ivan said.
Haille nodded and spread his sheets out next to the folios. Just as he sat down, the bell tower struck the 7th hour. Ivan stopped, his own mug of tea halfway to his lips.
How time flies. I'm doing the practice hall already. Haille, do me a favor and return these to the shelves, will you?
But I'm not allowed to stay here without you, am I?
These books are banned for children, he said, looking up at a bust of Haille Hillbourne that stared out like a watchful guard. It was Haille who banned belief in superstition and the practice of magic.
Foolishness.
And the
enemy of reason and logic,
he had called it. Ivan's eyes slid sideways to the bust for a moment before returning back to Haille. Well, I don't see any inquisitors here, and you are supposed to help Master Gilbert.
I am.
Good, then I'm off.
He drained his cup of tea, pulled an apple from his pocket, tossed it in the air, caught it, and then took a loud bite out of it just as he disappeared between two towering shelves. Haille was left alone watching dust motes swirl in Ivan's wake. He remained rooted in place for a long while, feeling as if the bust of his ancestor were watching and that some alarm would sound if he stepped in any direction. I could just play dumb, he decided, stepping around the table. To his surprise, he could not even read some of the words in the folios, for they were written in strange letters. Even the letters he knew were in combinations making words he did not know. The pages themselves were paper jewels, mixtures of colored inks he had never seen before. Ordinary red, yellow, green, and blue were accompanied by carmine, amber, malachite, and indigo. Even the black shading sparkled with flecks of silver, stars in the night sky. The very vellum they were painted on was pristine, free of wear despite its age. This was likely due to the fact that these were forbidden texts, and no one but instructors and historians was allowed to open them. Haille Hillbourne had banned these texts in the founding charters of their kingdom at a time when ignorance was still rife. In addition to tax collectors, castle guards, and regular soldiers, Haille Hillbourne had founded an entire class of enforcers. Inquisitors. Men and women who prowled the city and the countryside, punishing the superstitious for their foolish and simple-minded practices. But Ivan had been right. There were no inquisitors here. They were easy enough to spot in their gray cloaks and yellow surcoats. Haille actually saw few in the city. Everyone knew that city dwellers were more sophisticated than the villagers in the countryside. That was where superstition flourished and the majority of inquisitors' work waited for them. He leaned over the table, his eyes drinking in the colors. He moved to close the other folios and smaller books to at least make a show of performing his duties. But he left the nearest and largest open. It was the one Ivan had been looking at last. On one page ran lines of elegant, flowing script. On the opposite was an elaborate drawing of a blue-green statue. It was a woman with stylized features that made her look beautiful and exotic. She was slender and lithe, her body wrapped in a robe that stuck close to the contours of her body as if she had just stepped out of a pool. Her headpiece was made of hexagons filled with amber, and from its crown coursed rivulets of water that ran the length of her arms to her outstretched hands, from which flowed streams into two waiting basins that emptied into a third larger basin at her feet. The statue was carved out of the wall of a cavern flanked by deep chasms on either side. One would have to walk over a narrow walkway covered in rippling water to reach her. Haille lost track of time, delighting in the detail, the depth, and the realism of the artwork. Curious to know more, he read the writing on the facing page. The font of Jasmine, a boon to those afflicted with sicknesses and maladied from birth. For those who touch its waters will be granted any wish. Haille swallowed. Here was pure superstition, fantasy, the stuff of wives' tales and fireside yarns, nothing he was supposed to be reading. But like a spreading fire, already his mind was alive with possibilities. Could such a place be real? Why would Ivan have been reading about it? Why would he want Haille to find it? Was it a cure? A shuffle of footsteps startled him. He lifted the cover of the folio up and slapped it shut, checking over his shoulder as he gathered the remaining tomes, playing the part of the diligent helper and obedient student,
shutting away such texts and not lingering over them. The footsteps came from an adjacent aisle. Haille caught sight of someone, shorter than he, in a drab-colored cloak with tattered edges. Another student? He piled the books and folios on his arms and followed, lightly as not to give himself away. The figure went deeper into the forbidden stacks, twisting and turning around shelves as if familiar with them. Haille followed, noticing a flash of light blue beneath the cloak, likely the coat of another student, who also should not have been amid the stacks. He was sure of his hunch when he heard Master Gilbert's voice echo off the ceiling.
"Right over here, you might find something by Bellet."
He was still with the scribe Haille had seen earlier. Whomever Haille was following reversed direction, trying to avoid the librarian. Haille pursued along a parallel aisle, looking over rows of books to make sure he did not lose sight of the intruder who was running now. Haille ran too, as best he could on his tiptoes and laden with books. One tome began to slip as he took bigger steps, and he reached down to grab it. Distracted, he collided with the other student as they both turned the corner. The books tumbled to the floor. Haille fell backwards onto his tailbone. His legs sprawled out before him while the other student fell in the opposite direction, a book landing with a soft thud on her chest. Haille looked up into a familiar face.